Nuestro próximo invitado es la profesora Aksumov, que es profesora de neuropsicología en la Universidad de San Diego, en California. Su interés inicial es el autismo y es un poco lo que le llevó a involucrarse con la investigación con el profesor Grossfeld. Entonces, ella va a hablar de los aspectos conductuales y cognitivos del Jacobsen.
First, I'd like to thank all of you for having me here, and Ximena for all of her assistance. It's quite an honor to be here, and I'd like to I'd like to certainly acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Paul Grossfeld, who had been working with one of my close colleagues, Dr. Sarah Mattson, who's also a neuropsychologist in San Diego. And it was in 2010 that Dr. Mattson and Dr. Grossfeld first invited me to join them along with the 11Q Research and Resource Group to join in with seeing the families that come to San Diego every 2 years to get information and who give back to us by participating in our research work together. Oops. So as I said, we have a conference every 2 years, and Dr. Grossfeld has been working on this since 2006. We also have some families that will come to us at other times. And in our research, before the families come to visit us, we have them fill out questionnaires, such as Dr. Martina had invited you to do. And what I'm going to be talking about is the information that we've gathered from the families about their children's development and primarily about the behavior concerns that they have. I'm going to be talking about what we call adaptive behavior, which is a variety of different functions that we look at in children in terms of how they're doing compared to what we would expect for self-care, for their communication skills, their behavioral development, and their social development. And I will also be talking about my interest in some of the characteristics that we've seen in some of the patients that looks like autism spectrum disorder. So this is a summary across the different patients that we've seen. This is data from 71 children. The different types of symptoms, as Dr. Martina explained, that we see in children with Jacobsen syndrome. You can see that some of the most common characteristics, as you know, are problems with blood, and also if the children have been hospitalized. Some of the medical complications that we see across patients might be more rare. Only about 10% of the children that we've seen have had some type of seizures. Many children have vision problems, etc. So there's a range of different types of medical issues that we see across these children. In terms of developmental milestones, most children have some delays, and in some cases that might be the first signs that something is not quite right in some of the children that are later diagnosed with 11Q disorder. Many children, you can see here, these are the expectations in terms of how old the children should be when they first learn to crawl, when they're first eating solid foods, etc. And what we see across children with Jacobsen syndrome is that the ages at which these sorts of developmental milestones are achieved tend to be delayed with quite a bit of variability. And in some of the patients that we've seen, maybe they were younger and they had not quite yet started developing some of these sorts of developments. We're particularly interested in the behavior of children and how they do in school. And as I said, some of these children may not have yet been old enough to start attending school. What we find across the children that we've seen Most of the children that we've seen are from the United States, but we've seen children from other countries as well. Their school performance, as you might expect, tends to be affected, so many children will get special education resources. They may have to repeat a grade in school. We see that at least half the children have some sorts of behavior problems, and I'll talk about these in a little bit more detail. So in terms of the characteristics that we see for children with Jacobsen syndrome, we rely very heavily on parent reports, and we do this not only just in terms of interviewing the parents, but also having them fill out standardized types of questionnaires that ask about a whole variety of behavior problems that are common with children, to see what seems to be more specific or more common amongst children with Jacobsen syndrome. And one of the types of questionnaires that we rely on is called the Child Behavior Checklist. And this is a series of questions, about 100 different types of questions that we ask parents to tell us about what are the sorts of things that you find challenging about your child. And we compare those results with the types of results that are obtained for parents of children of different ages. So what sorts of difficulties does your child have compared to other children their same age? And here you can see there's different sorts of symptoms that are described as whether the child might have more anxious or depressed sorts of difficulties, whether they appear more withdrawn than you might expect, whether they have physical complaints, what we call somatic complaints, to what degree are there social problems, thought problems or unusual sorts of behaviors, attention problems, does the child get into trouble a lot, breaking rules, and do they have more trouble than you might expect with aggression? And here what you can see is these are standard scores, and this is sort of the normal range of what you might expect for children at different ages. So what this graph shows you here is that there seem to be more social problems amongst the children that we've seen, and particularly pretty significant attention problems. And this meaning being able to stay focused on what's happening, not getting too distracted, etc. And lots of the children that we've seen, the parents report difficulties with the children being able to focus their attention, being able to pay attention to what people are trying to tell them, giving them instructions, etc. And these attention problems are really common across all sorts of children who have a variety of developmental problems, and can be very frustrating for parents as well as teachers, because if you can't get a child to focus on what information is being given to them, then it makes it a lot more difficult for them to learn, as well as to follow instructions, etc. So this has been interesting for us. Here, from that same child behavior checklist are the results for more specific types of symptoms. So what psychologists like to do is to see if we have these different types of difficulties, do they fit within some sort of a pattern? And so these have been categorized into different patterns that are consistent with other known diagnoses: attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, what we call affective disorder, so depression, mood disorder sorts of problems, anxiety, conduct problems, meaning again, to what degree does the child seem to get in trouble, or more serious sorts of behavior issues? Are they oppositional? And what about more sort of physical sorts of complaints? And these data are showing how many children with Jacobsen syndrome that we've seen are more typical. They don't seem to have these sorts of problems, or do they have more clinically significant problems in these domains? And what you can see is the most common sorts of difficulties that we've seen are consistent with these attention deficit hyperactivity sorts of symptoms. So not only having trouble paying attention, but also being too active, getting into trouble in terms of not being able to stay focused, being impulsive, etc., similar to children with ADHD who don't have Jacobsen syndrome. So our question has been, do we seem to see ADHD more elevated than we would expect in children with Jacobsen syndrome? When you look at those questionnaire results, what we can see is that about 35% of the children that we've seen have this sort of borderline difficulties in terms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and 39% in the more clinically significant range. So these seem to be more than half the children seem to have these sorts of problems according to parent report. The highest scores were in the attention problem range. And across the families that we've seen, about 38% of the families said that their child had been given a diagnosis in the past of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So when these parents had seen the pediatrician or other sorts of specialists, they had met the criteria for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and about 14% of all the families said that their child had been given some sort of medications to try to address some of those difficulties in terms of ADHD. In terms of disruptive behaviors, as I said, about 21% of those children who had disruptive behavior problems met criteria for ADHD. But only about 11% had more oppositional defiant problems, and none of the children that we've seen have had conduct disorder sorts of difficulties in terms of getting into real significant problems that are more serious. So this just says that for a lot of the children that have trouble paying attention, who are very impulsive, who are more hyperactive, they tend to have a harder time staying focused and are more disruptive. So these data, we've been able to see some of the families over time. They've come back to San Diego across the different conferences, so we've been very lucky to collect information about how these children seem from the times when we see them when they're younger to when they get to be a little bit older. So what this slide shows you here is across different ages, from 6 to 15 years of age. And if we look at the level of difficulties consistent with these ADHD sorts of symptoms, how many children are in the typical range, not having those sorts of difficulties compared to other children their age, how many children, or which children have more borderline sorts of difficulties or more elevated or serious sorts of symptoms. And what you can see is that for many children, their symptoms seem to be fairly consistent or stable across age. And remember, again, we compare them to children their same age, so we might expect more attention problems in younger children and that these should get better over time, but these are corrected for age. So some children who had more serious symptoms when they were younger, these seem to be fairly consistent as they get older. The children who don't seem to have those difficulties when they're younger, they don't seem to emerge as they get older. And then so for some children, there's a little bit more inconsistent patterns across time. What we don't have very much information about is to what degree these children have received much specific types of interventions, and that would be important to know. Perhaps if some children had been able to get more help when they're younger, perhaps we can see some change over time. So we've been particularly interested in the level of cognitive abilities and in children with Jacobsen syndrome, as well as their adaptive behavior skills compared to other children their same age. And what we have found, what we've reported in the literature, what other people have also reported, is the size of the deletion on the 11q seems to be related to the amount of difficulties that children have or the level of disability they have in terms of IQ. So as you may know, when we talk about an IQ or level of intelligence, the average for the population is 100. That's the expected average, and obviously there's a lot of variability. So most of the population, if you measure their IQ, is within this range. About over half the population will have IQs in this range, and then fewer individuals will have lower IQs. So amongst the patients that we've seen with Jacobsen syndrome, by and large, IQs are lower than you would expect, with a lot of variation. But this graph shows you that the larger the deletion size, the lower the IQ, the more affected intelligence is, seems to be related to the size of the deletion. And obviously there's a certain amount of variability, but this seems to be a pretty consistent trend. What about adaptive behavior skills? These are measured on the same sort of scale, so the average should be about 100. And these, we take a composite across information that we get from the parents in terms of how is the child doing compared to other children their age in terms of their communication skills, their social skills, their ability to take care of themselves. As children get older, we expect them to be able to dress themselves, feed themselves, etc. And again, we see this relationship with the larger the deletion, the more delays, the more impairments that children have in terms of adaptive behavior as well. It's not to say that as children get older that they remain the same. They do continue to develop these skills, but there's still a gap between where they are compared to other children their same age where we might expect them to be. And these are data from children ages 5 to 18. We've also been able to look at those data from the child behavior checklist in terms of behavioral concerns and how is that related to deletion size. We don't see as much of a correlation. So some children that have smaller deletions still have more behavioral concerns and vice versa. So there's a less strong relationship. There is somewhat of a relationship. The larger deletion, the more behavior concerns parents might report. And also there doesn't seem to be as strong a correlation as we see with IQ in terms of attention problems in these children. There's somewhat of a relationship, but it doesn't seem to be as consistent. So, and this is interesting too because with children that are that have a smaller deletion and therefore might have a higher IQ, it's important to recognize that they may be more likely to have attention problems than might be expected, and those might be a bit easier to address in those children. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about autism spectrum disorder and some of our findings that we've reported on in Jacobsen syndrome. So autism spectrum disorder is a complicated disorder that has primarily behavioral difficulties. The children with autism have difficulties when it comes to social communication and interactions with others, and what we call restricted and repetitive behaviors. So most people know about autism to some degree. The literature in terms of the children that have been studied with autism tends to focus on children who don't have a known genetic condition. And yet we have found in Jacobsen syndrome and in other genetic conditions that a subset of children seem to have these same sorts of characteristics. It might be for different reasons, but what's interesting is to acknowledge these and to try to help children with improving these sorts of skills. So difficulties with engaging in interactions with others, communicating with others, things like eye contact, using gestures to communicate with others. And when we talk about restricted or repetitive behaviors, getting stuck on certain types of things to an excessive degree. This makes it difficult for children with autism to be flexible because they have a hard time changing their focus of attention, engaging in more appropriate sorts of behaviors and activities, etc. There's quite a bit of range in terms of the severity of these sorts of difficulties that we see in children. So autism, as it stands, is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and it's defined completely on the basis of behavior. So therefore, there can be many different reasons that a child might have these sorts of difficulties. And there's certainly a strong genetic component, and that's why we were interested in looking at autism in Jacobsen syndrome, since this is a genetic disorder. And we see a lot of diversity in the presentation of autism across children. So I'm going to just briefly report on the data that we published in the journal Genetics and Medicine. with Dr. Grossfeld and Dr. Mattson. And in this study, we looked at 17 children that were between the ages of 4 to 21. These were children that I saw in San Diego as part of our research conference. We also reported in this paper on 3 additional children who had more unusual types of deletions. We had the parents of all of the families, of all the children, complete a specific questionnaire called the Social Communication Questionnaire, which asks specific questions that are related to an autism diagnosis. And then I gave each of the children a standardized observation called the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. This is a play-based assessment that's sensitive to the sorts of difficulties that children with a diagnosis of autism might have, where even if the child doesn't have any spoken language, there's a standardized way that I try to engage the child in play, in communication, and see how they respond compared to what we would expect for a child at their language level. What we found is in this study of 17 children with Jacobsen syndrome, almost half of them did meet criteria for autism spectrum disorder based on what the parents reported and our standardized assessment. We also found that in 3 additional cases, 2 of those had an atypical deletion that was, they met criteria for autism as well. In one of the additional cases was a young child that we saw who already had a diagnosis of autism, which we confirmed. So we set that aside as a separate case. And so because we're interested in the mapping in terms of what does this tell us about Jacobsen syndrome, what does this tell us specifically about why do some children with Jacobsen syndrome seem to have the characteristics of autism compared to others who do not, it's not a straightforward type of story at this point, but what you can see is that this is one patient that we saw who had the smallest deletion, who also met criteria for autism. And then these are the 3 additional cases. One case who had come to us already with a diagnosis of autism, and then 2 cases who had an interstitial deletion who also met criteria for autism. And in this one patient, we didn't see, but I was able to do a lengthy interview with the parents over the phone. This particular child has a very small deletion, and the commonality across these children seems to be perhaps within this region of the gene. And this just is mapped out further. So scientists have been able to look specifically at different genes within the 11q terminal area to try to understand what do these specific genes seem to be responsible for. And there's been interest in this particular region because in mice studies, when this gene has been deleted, there seems to be characteristics of autism in the mice and some reversal of symptoms with certain types of medications. And this just shows you that if we look across this region of the 11q, as I said, with the larger deletion, there seems to be more degree of intellectual impairment in patients with Jacobsen syndrome. And it seems to be, not surprisingly, that there are a variety of genes within this region. And certain genes, if they're deleted in combination, seems to be associated with more significant types of intellectual impairment. The more we learn about these specific genes, it seems that they are important for development of the brain and development of cognitive functions, and therefore there seems to be good reason to expect that that's why we see some of these phenotypic characteristics across children with Jacobsen syndrome. So in conclusion, the deletion size in Jacobsen syndrome seems to be related to the degree of intellectual disability that we see in children, both in terms of IQ as well as adaptive behavior. Behavior concerns amongst parents are relatively common in children with Jacobsen syndrome, and the symptoms in particular that we have found across the children that we've studied are associated with those sorts of symptoms that are described under the sort of bigger umbrella term of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. These sorts of difficulties in terms of being able to pay attention, to stay focused and to not be impulsive are pretty common across many different types of developmental conditions in children. But it's important to recognize those difficulties and to address them, particularly in children at a very young age. It can be really difficult with children who have limited communication skills to address some of those sorts of behavior problems. But from my clinical experience, the earlier that parents and teachers recognize these sorts of attention problems and behavior problems and figure out ways to really help their child, the better the outcome for those children, as well as the less frustration that families have for being able to improve their child's development across time. We've also, as I said, reported these symptoms that are associated with autism spectrum disorder. What we found is that in some of the families, these symptoms are relatively mild, but their children have benefited a lot from specific types of behavioral interventions in school and at home. The same sorts of interventions that we use for children that have autism without a known genetic condition can be very helpful for improving their daily lives as well as improving their ability to function as they get older. So early assessments and intervention services are very important. When children are very young, sometimes they may not necessarily get the help that they need, perhaps because physicians and other professionals may not see the need or wait until the child gets a little bit older. But the earlier the interventions and help the children can get, the better as they get older. And definitely getting help at school as well as home is needed as these children get older. And that's all. Thank you.
Tenemos tiempo tenemos 10 minutos para, podemos hacer a lo mejor una ronda de preguntas. So we still have 10 minutes. Okay. So maybe if you, Teresa, can come and Natasha could come to the table and take questions from the audience. Sí, ¿alguna pregunta? Maybe. Sí. Voy a abrir el fuego. So, what about Chiral? Not fashionable anymore, Natasha. The gene, Chiral, yes. Which was one of the genes that was initially. Are you going to talk about that?
Maybe I don't have it in my thought, but I can answer the question.
I think Paul is better than me.
So the question is, what about another gene that Natasha did not talk about called Kirrel, Kirrel? Probably there's more than one gene that can contribute to autism in Jacobsen syndrome, but we clearly have evidence that one can cause autism in Jacobsen syndrome without having a deletion of the Kirrel gene. And that's going to be what I talk about in a few minutes in further detail, what that other gene does, and based on our understanding, how we might be able to treat medically.
Sí, bueno, la pregunta es, en cuanto a la pérdida de genes, si sabiendo el gen específico que está perdido, bueno, sabemos que no hay dos iguales, pero si las características de la pérdida de un gen, sabiendo cuáles, si coinciden en muchos de los casos. Esa sería la pregunta.
I am not I didn't understand.
Si la pérdida de, sabiendo el gen exacto que puede, la delección, perdón.
No, there is not one gene. There is some genes, and some that are very important are FLI1. FLI1 is for problems with platelet. But with regard to kidneys, it looks as though wherever the loss is, maybe the problem with the kidney is the same. So it's difficult to find one single gene for that. For heart, I think FLI1 is still, no? ETS1, sorry.
Next story.
Yes. Anyway, these are the two most important, ETS1 and FLI1 for the, but it's not just one gene, it's a region. All chromosome disorders are due to contiguous genes, a number of genes that are close. But the real cause for the clinical features are not connected strictly to that. There is some connection, but there is something more, we don't know yet what it is. It's just the imbalance that gives a number of features which are not very specific, but they are common in chromosome disorders. And they are due to the imbalance, whatever it is.
Es para Natacha. He visto que la parte de la que hablan de la pérdida que está relacionada con el autismo, yo creo que es justo la que tiene mi hija que le falta, ¿no? Entonces, ¿puede ser que le falten esos genes en esa zona y que no tenga rasgos autistas?
So are you saying that you...
So Jimena is missing the part you were talking about that is related to autism.
Mhm.
And I think,
Which includes these genes.
Oh, okay. Uh-huh.
could it be that she's missing that part but has nothing, is not showing autism spectrum? Because she's not at all.
Right, so it's possible, right?
Incomplete penetrance.
Right, right. And I think this goes back to your question as well. What we see are certain probabilities that, you know, if we look across a sample of people that a higher than expected proportion have that deletion and show those symptoms, but then there are these exceptions. And some children may have that deletion but don't show those symptoms. And I know it's frustrating because then you don't know what's going on. I would say that it's possible that that maybe she might have some features, but not the, you know, the full syndrome, or she doesn't show those features at all.
So there's somebody disagreeing in the audience. Okay.
Oh, okay. Oh, absolutely, absolutely, yes.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Sí.
Maybe I can add a little bit that it's actually very common in most human genetic syndromes that for example, in Jacobsen syndrome, you can have two children with the identical deletion,
Yes.
and yet clinically they may be very different. So one may have a normal heart, for example, one may have a very severe congenital heart defect. So that's easy to tell in the beginning. For the behavior things, it's a little more challenging, but one of the things my lab is very interested in doing, actually using animal models, is to try to understand what those other factors are that might actually prevent, for example, having a heart defect even though that heart gene is missing. I hope that makes sense. So it's true for most of the features, and that's why your children have a lot in common, but yet every child is unique and has their own set of problems.
Can I add something? I showed you that each child has two chromosomes 11. One is deleted. What is in the other one? That gene in the other one may be low functioning, high functioning, normal functioning. And so even with just that information, you can see different features: severe, mild, normal. Just the same gene on the other chromosome could tell you something. But there are thousands of genes that influence that one missing in the other chromosomes, or in the same chromosome somewhere else. So we must know more.
I was very intrigued by what you mentioned about the evolutionary heart changes. And you mentioned, yes, coarctation of the aorta.
Yes.
So can that develop afterwards? Yes,
Yes. This is,
We-
need to follow up.
to follow, okay.
Hola, buenos días. En nuestro caso, está aquí María con nosotros, tiene 18 años y lleva muchos años que tiene problemas de ansiedad, depresión y de conducta, y lleva tomando medicación durante muchos años. Entonces nosotros quisiéramos saber si hay conocimiento de, a lo largo de, según vaya creciendo y llega a ser más mayor, si este tipo de problemas se pueden llegar a reducir o va a necesitar ayuda psicológica y farmacológica durante toda su vida. Y sobre todo, bueno, más que nada ella ha venido con nosotros porque ella nos hace muchas preguntas, ella ve que es diferente que los demás de su edad y que su comportamiento muchas veces no es normal, y ella quiere saber qué es lo que le pasa, por qué le pasa, si va a ser así siempre, y nosotros no sabemos contestarle. Entonces me gustaría pues directamente que le contestaseis a ella, y para que ella pues sus dudas o sus cosas pues las tenga un poquito más claras, si puede ser. Gracias.
Well, I would say that it's difficult to. Oh, I'm going to take this. It's difficult to predict. It's certainly important to try to figure out what sorts of treatments seem to be helpful, and to also try to find some resources for activities and particularly work experiences or activities so that she can reach her highest potential in terms of occupation as well as social activities, being able to find social opportunities with other people that make her feel comfortable and that she can share some common experiences in addition to her family life, I think can be quite beneficial. Are those sorts of, have you been able to find those kinds of opportunities for her? Or has she been able to find opportunities outside the home?
Pues es que siempre ha tenido siempre ha tenido muchos problemas a la hora de mantener las amistades y relacionarse con los demás. Entonces eso al final es un círculo vicioso, como no tiene amigos porque tiene muchos problemas para relacionarse con la gente, eso le crea ansiedad, frustración, eso genera que ha tenido problemas de autolesiones, ha estado interna porque ha tenido depresión y muchísima ansiedad y se autolesionaba, y al final ella se ve diferente, como se ve diferente, eso le genera, o sea, tiene muchísimo problema para mantener amistades y para estar con gente. Entonces, a la hora de estar en una actividad así, ella es muy buena, es muy cariñosa, coge la actividad igual con muchísima ilusión, pero luego le cuesta mantener, no sé, relacionarse con la gente, siempre ha tenido muchísimos problemas.
Okay. So, are we scheduled to talk together tomorrow?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So, and I'd be happy to talk with you more tomorrow. Gracias.
Sí, ¿alguna pregunta más? Si no, yo creo que vamos a pasar, entonces pasamos a la pausa café y estamos aquí de vuelta